One of the promises that Joe Biden made when he was campaigning for president was to address the climate crisis, to get the U.S. back in the Paris Climate Accords and to take other actions. Some of those things he started to deliver on. To weigh in on his actions so far and what we can expect in the administration is co-founder of the Sunrise Movement, Varshini Prakash. She's also a contributor with a new essay to a new book called The New Possible: Visions of Our World Beyond Crisis. Great to have you, Varshini. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Let's actually start with the book. You've contributed an essay to the book. What is this anthology all about, and what is your portion of it?
Yeah, well, my section of it is really about transforming what we believed was politically impossible to becoming politically possible and then inevitable. And I feel like in a lot of ways that has been the story of the last 2 or 3 years. Climate was a total political loser in many ways 3 or 4 years ago. You would be hard pressed to find a politician that was willing to talk about it on the campaign trail. And now you've seen movements, insurgent candidates, coming together to really actually manifest a vision of climate justice that is now being, in many ways, touted and incorporated into the President of the United States of America's climate plans. So it's about, the new possible and imagining the new future that we can have and actually bringing that into reality.
Yeah, so talk about that. You gave me the perfect segue. We've seen a number of executive orders already, one that had long been promised, getting back into the Paris Climate Accords, also going further than that. One of the things that really interested me in the Biden executive orders was the directive to create a civilian, is that conservation corps?
Civilian Climate Corps.
Climate Corps, thank you. But there's no indication of how large a size it will be, how much budget will be allocated towards it. So just give sort of your overview so far of how you think the Biden administration is doing and what you're hoping to see in the future.
Yeah, all in all, I've thought the first week of the new Biden administration was in many ways a breath of fresh air. I think they were off to a very strong start. And we saw many of the sort of demands and priorities of the youth climate movement incorporated in this slew of executive orders in the first week. The creation, or at least the intent to create, a civilian climate corps, which is based off of the Civilian Conservation Corps of FDR's era, where they employed over 3 million people in the work of basically public works projects. And we could do the same thing, but employing young people, particularly those from disadvantaged communities, to cleaning up the environment and averting climate catastrophe. And we also called for essentially an Office of Climate Mobilization, which we have achieved. There will be an Office of Domestic Climate Policy, which will be aligning and unifying every federal agency towards, putting out an all-of-government approach to addressing climate change. And the most exciting one is something called the Justice 40 Initiative, which basically directs 40% of climate-relevant funding towards communities of color, tribal nations, and poor communities. And so I think what we're seeing is a number of actions on the executive front, and this, I would say, represents a very strong first few steps in averting the climate crisis. And of course, there's a lot more to be done.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I've been trying to dig into these executive orders to see exactly what they say and do and indicate. And at this point, it's a little bit hard to judge, to be honest with you. So on the Civilian Climate Corps, for example, which is one of the ideas I said I think is really exciting and borrows from that FDR model, it's a directive to create a task force to look into how they create this, right? And so it specifically says that it should be existing budget appropriations that this should be funded with. So on that piece in particular, do you have any assurances from the Biden administration or any expectation for how large that should be, how many people it should employ, what the wages ultimately should look like? I guess what I'm asking is, when that is ultimately created, what is kind of your metric of success or the bar that you'll be looking for?
Right. Well, I mean, ultimately, we believe that whatever the Civilian Climate Corps looks like, it should guarantee every worker that is a part of it to have a living wage, to have access access to a union and have the capacity to collectively organize. We want these jobs to be available to hopefully millions of young Americans. And we want the jobs to be specifically tasked towards, promoting climate justice. So it could look like perhaps cleaning up toxic waste sites in some of the areas that have the most number of polluted zones, such as tribal nations, poor and rural communities, particularly Black and Latinx communities as well. And so it kind of runs the gambit for what this could look like. It could look like sustainable agriculture projects, water infrastructure projects, coastal restoration projects, climate adaptation projects. It really, runs the gambit. And I think what I'm going to be looking for from the Biden administration is we've seen an intent to create a really ambitious set and suite of climate programs. And now the process of executing them and implementing them is something we're going to be following very closely, and actually deeply would love to be a part of the process of crafting that alongside our young people.
Well, you all 100% should be. One other specific question I had for you, help me understand, because I know this was a priority of you and of the Sunrise Movement, of the young activists that were involved, the creation of the Climate Office and what you call a whole of government approach to the climate crisis. What does that mean, and why do you think that that's really significant?
Yeah. Well, for a long time, the issue of climate and the issue of environment has been sort of relegated to the EPA or to the Department of Energy. And ultimately, the climate, it's everything that we can touch and feel and see. It impacts every aspect of our lives. And so this basically says this is not just for DOE or EPA to administrate. This is a project that affects virtually every federal agency that exists, whether it's Health and Human Services or HUD or agriculture or whatever. This has to be an approach by which every federal agency needs to come to the table with what their climate plan will be and on what timeline. And thankfully, we have people like Gina McCarthy and Ali Zaidi who will be heading up this Office of National Domestic Climate Policy and aligning those government forces, and also working, in collaboration with state and local governments as well.
And Varshini, finally, sometimes I feel like some of the politicians haven't caught up to where you understand public sentiment to be. So I've been looking in particular at the state of West Virginia, which is both famously a coal state and also famously represented by Joe Manchin, who was kind of the sticking point anytime we want to pass anything good through the now democratically controlled Senate. And even in that state where there's more skepticism than the nation at large, you have a strong majority, I think it's 63% is the number that comes to my head, of West Virginians who say they would like to see the government investing in green jobs, and a strong majority that says they are concerned about the climate crisis. So what would your message be to Senator Manchin, now President Biden, and that administration about the mandate for change and desire to move in a new direction in terms of the climate?
No, absolutely. And this is often the case, is that the people are far more aligned and far more ready to move on these issues and want government to take swift and urgent action to better people's lives frequently than the people who claim to represent them. And that's true, amongst Democrats, and it's also true amongst Republicans and Republican voters. And so, what I would say is the mandate is there from the public. The technology is with us. All we are lacking in this moment is political will. And so we have got to take this fight and not just, have Biden litigating these issues behind closed doors with obstructionist Democrats or Republicans. We need to bring this fight to the American people and dare those politicians to stop us from creating tens of millions of jobs directed at communities that have been left behind. Dare them to stop us from maintaining that clean air and clean water are inalienable human rights. This could be the greatest job creating, economy boosting program that this country has seen in a century or more. And, I think we've got to get to work.
Varshini, I was privy to some of the polling a couple cycles ago in the southernmost district of West Virginia, which is the, most coal country part of the state, also the poorest part of the state. And a lot of different messages were tested. And I admit I brought some of my own, preconceptions and stereotypes to the table. I was really shocked that actually the messaging that landed, it was either the best or it was close to the best, was about there had been a toxic chemical spill that had poisoned the water. And you have so many West Virginia towns that live under constant boil alerts where they never can feel safe to drink their own water. So to say that this community of people doesn't care about clean air and clean water is just completely belied by the facts. Last question for you, Varshini. What are some of Sunrise's plans on the political front to make sure that politicians who aren't living up to not just your expectations, but what the science tells us needs to be done, will be held accountable?
Well, we're going to do a lot of the things that we've been doing. We're going to build people power. We're going to continue demonstrating and organizing, and ensuring that those politicians hear from us and hear from their constituents across the board. And we're also going to continue to target politicians who might be vulnerable in 2022 and make sure that we're building both people power and political power alike and pushing on all fronts. So it's all systems go. We have about 6 to 8 months to pass what we hope will be the largest green infrastructure and jobs program in America. And, now is not the time to let up just because we have a Democratic president. Now is actually the time to push for it all.
Varshini Prakash, thank you so much. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And we'll have more rising for you after this.